Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our Day 3 large group panel on supporting a diverse education workforce, strengthening preparation, practice, and professional growth. My name is Lindsay Hayes, and I have the privilege of serving as the moderator for this panel. I'm a senior researcher based at the American Institutes for Research in Washington, D.C., and I've had the pleasure of working with many of you over the years on the CDER Center and other OSEP-funded projects. I'm very excited to be moderating the panel today because I think that the topic that we're going to be covering, which is supporting a diverse education workforce, lies at the intersection of several very important issues. First, this panel is intended to spotlight OSEP's work on personnel development. Many of you are familiar with OSEP's focus on attracting, preparing, and retaining effective special education personnel, including special education teachers, early intervention providers, and related services personnel. This panel will highlight issues related to the preparation, practice, and professional growth for these special education personnel in response to current needs in the field. Second, like many of the presentations we've heard from our colleagues over the past several days, we are going to be very deliberately exploring the concept of educational equity. Specifically, we're going to explore the relationship between educational equity and a diverse education workforce. Personnel preparation and development efforts, such as those supported by OSEP funding, have a critical role to play in ensuring that every student has equitable access to effective personnel who reflect the diversity of the children and families that they serve. Finally, as we begin our panel conversation, I think it's important to reflect on how the needs of the field have evolved over the past year and a half. As a country, and certainly as an educational system, we are in a very different place than we were even a year ago. Not only did we have to completely reconceptualize the idea of instruction and service delivery during the pandemic, but we are now faced with the challenges related to return to school and learning recovery efforts, especially for historically underserved communities and groups of students. Also, over the last year or so, our country has been in the midst of a massive reckoning about systemic racism and the extent to which systemic racism is baked into the very institutions on which we rely, including our educational institutions. Inequities in our education system have been with us for a very, very long time, but I think it's fair to say that the events of the past year and a half have exacerbated those inequities and really placed an increased urgency on the need for action. Next slide, please. And one more, please. So today we're going to hear from a very distinguished group of panelists about actions that they are taking to ensure that we have a diverse and effective special education personnel workforce who are prepared to face these challenges head on. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Erica Mccray from the University of Florida and the CDER Center, who will set the stage for talking about the diversity of the special education workforce and offer the perspective of an OSEP grantee who is working in the personnel preparation space. Next, we will hear from Dr. Jen Newton of Ohio University, who is going to discuss systemic barriers to the recruitment and retention of a diverse workforce, as well as a framework for creating equity-empowered systems. Next, we will hear from Dr. William Drakeford of Bowie State University, who is going to share some very exciting and innovative strategies for recruiting, preparing, and retaining diverse candidates across multiple special education programs. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Courtney Vancleave of the Mississippi Department of Education, who will offer the perspective of a state education agency on developing, supporting, and retaining special education personnel. Each panelist is going to offer prepared remarks, and then after each panelist, we will pause for questions and answers. I will moderate the Q&A portion, so if you have any questions that you would like to pose to our panelists, please submit those via the conference platform, and we will try our best to accommodate those questions. Next slide, please. With that, I would like to introduce our first panelist, which will be Dr. Erica Mccray of the University of Florida. Dr. Mccray is an associate professor of special education and the director of the School of Special Education, School Psychology, and Early Childhood Studies at the University of Florida. Currently, Dr. Mccray is a co-director for the Collaboration for Effective Educator Development, Accountability, and Reform, also known as the CDER Center. She's a co-principal and investigator on a National Science Foundation project aimed to broaden participation in engineering, and a principal investigator on the MARC project at the University of Florida, designed to support including anti-racism content across the undergraduate curriculum. Prior to becoming university faculty, Dr. Mccray served as a special educator for students identified with behavioral and learning disabilities in Title I elementary and middle schools. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Mccray, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. It's a pleasure to be here. About this time, we would be spending time in Crystal City, but it's good to be able to still meet up with colleagues even in the virtual space. As Lindsay mentioned, I taught students identified with behavioral and learning disabilities, and I started my career as an out-of-field teacher. I earned my special education credential through a personal preparation grant funded through OSEP, and subsequently earned my doctoral degree starting on a leadership grant funded by OSEP. So I really have always benefited from the expertise and the commitment of OSEP to bring in educators and make sure that they were prepared for the diversity of students that they would serve. On the next slide, I'll begin by setting the stage. This is not surprising. These numbers have been numbers that we've been talking about for years. When we look at the teacher workforce and the student population in our schools, the diversity, there are disparities that persist. As I'm sure my colleagues will also mention, we have a discrepancy between the educator workforce, the teacher workforce being predominantly white and female. And the student diversity continues to increase, which doesn't automatically create an issue, but it can create an opportunity. So when we think about the number of teachers coming into our schools, the number of leaders coming into our schools, and the various pathways that they enter into those school settings, we have to be thinking about what do they need and what do they need to know and what do they need to be able to do to meet the needs of students who may have very different backgrounds than they do. We can't think about it just at the classroom level, though. We have to also think about school building level, district level, state level, and on a national scale, knowing that we'll have to individualize or tailor needs and expectations by context. So on the next slide, I'll share a little bit about my own experience of attracting, preparing, and retaining. In this picture, I think this probably reflects those numbers in a visual way. This is one of my former students at the University of Florida. She actually looks about the size of her students. Jessica is in the left-hand corner, a young white woman who came to the program committed to working in urban schools. That was her desire from the very beginning. And once she graduated from our program, she went to the Atlanta metro area, and this was one of her first classrooms of students. You can see the diversity of the students reflected there. And she stayed there for a number of years before transitioning into a teacher leadership role. But when I think about the prompts of attract, prepare, and retain, attracting who to what, preparing who for what, and then retaining them how. We're looking for an educator workforce that understands the historical and contemporary challenges facing students of color, identify with disabilities, and that they must be prepared effectively to meet their learning needs, attending to cultural, racial, and linguistic assets as the basis for their instruction. So even our students identified with disabilities come to the classroom with strengths, and we need to prepare a workforce that is prepared to see that. They also have to understand that a part of this work is redressing persistent inequities caused by racism, ableism, linguicism, as Lindsay mentioned earlier. And it's necessary for us all to maintain a socio-historical understanding of why certain groups might not see education as a viable or desirable career path. These challenges are evident in P through 20 and beyond, and it shows up in preparation and practice. So if we want to attract a diverse cadre of teachers and leaders, we have to think about what was their experience when they were in school. Does it bring up good memories for them? Do they see an opportunity for them to be represented in that workforce and in those classrooms? And do they see opportunities for them to create change in ways that matters to them and their communities? The environments and the structures that maintain those inequities that show up in policies and practices, whether in preparation programs or in P through 12 schools, we often see what can be considered an unwelcoming or a non-inclusive or supportive environment for teachers of color, potential teachers of color, and even their white allies. So these pervasive issues won't change unless we address them systemically and comprehensively. And so I'll talk a little bit on the next slide about how we are doing this work through the CDER Center. We were first funded in 2013 to look at the professional learning system and the ways that we can more comprehensively address the needs of students with disabilities by not just focusing on special education teacher preparation, not just focusing on what's happening in classrooms, but also thinking about who are all of the professionals that need to be on one accord when it comes to meeting these students' needs, and how do they get into the system? So how do we attract them? How are they prepared in our systems? And then how do we retain them? So our primary focus areas lie in standards, licensure, and program approval, preparation program reform, thinking about general education, special education, and educational leadership, and then preparation program evaluation and review processes to support the ongoing improvement of preparation and alignment with standards, licensure, and program approval. In our first 5 years, we learned that there were some features that the states and systems that were really ready to take up this work had in common. There's this desire and a comprehensive look at alignment, data collection and use through comprehensive statewide and district level systems. And then equity and access is another piece that we felt like was a non-negotiable for us as we entered our second round. What does that mean to us? When we think about equity and access, particularly as it pertains to a diverse educator workforce, we're thinking about who is entering. Are we getting the most diverse educator workforce that we can possibly get? And then are all educators prepared to be culturally responsive? So that equity and access piece not only supports the needs of all learners, but it also allows us to ensure that the educator workforce is reflective and representative of the diversity of our country and the student population that I described on the first slide. So as a center, we have provided a number of products and services that are available universally on our website. So thinking about how do we ensure that our programs reflect culturally responsive teaching practices, and then how do we shore up those opportunities, not only in pre-service education, but in-service education through professional development. So I hope that you will check out those resources and consider in your spheres of influence, how can you be working towards equity and access, not only in diversifying the educator workforce, but ensuring that all teachers and leaders are prepared to be culturally responsive. And Lindsay, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Mccray. We're going to pause now for some questions and answers. So I have a few questions here for you. First, and I'm paraphrasing here, you mentioned that education is sometimes not perceived as an attractive or a viable profession for candidates from diverse backgrounds. Can you speak a little bit more about that and specifically some of the things that we can do to change that perception?
Absolutely. If you think about P-12 school systems, they're typically a process that everyone has an experience with, right? We've either had a teacher, I can think back to when I had my first Black teacher. And I wonder, for those of us who are in the virtual room, can you remember the first time you had a teacher that looked like you? For some of us, you might not have ever had a teacher who looks like you. For some of us, you may have only had teachers who look like you. And so depending on how those experiences form our perspective on teaching or education as a career, that will potentially affect who we can attract to the field. If I have had really good experiences, I might see myself as a teacher or as a leader. If I've had really challenging and difficult experiences and I could not wait to get out of P-12, then that might not be the route I want to go. So how do we make sure that over time, this is not a system that was put in place overnight, but over time, how can we change the perception of education and the opportunities that are presented?
Great, thank you. Could you provide some examples of things that CDER states or CDER partner universities have done in order to diversify their workforce and or focus on culturally responsive education practices?
Absolutely. A number of our states are working on culturally responsive educational practices from pre-service preparation for teachers and leaders using our innovation configurations and our course enhancement module materials, all the way through what does that look like in service? How do we make sure that we're creating a more seamless preparation so that school districts are partnering with EPPs, educator preparation providers, and they're speaking common language and implementing common practices. So one example, and Courtney might speak to this a little bit, our state team in Mississippi, their Teaching and Leading Solutions group started from program review and approval processes. They immediately reviewed what was in place, identified gaps. They wanted to make sure that it was very explicit what was expected for teachers of students with disabilities, not just special education teachers, but teachers of students with disabilities. They wanted to make sure that there were competencies embedded in program review processes that reflected culturally responsive practice. They also then looked at their certification and made sure that those same competencies were embedded there. And so they also brought school district partners to the table to ask what were some of the contextual factors that they might not have, firsthand knowledge of at the state level because they're a bit removed from the day-to-day operations. And so that's just one example, but a number of our states are thinking about who are the students that we need to continue to try to reach, like Georgia. California also brings in English language learners as a need. And so how are we helping them think about what's happening in our context? Who are the students that we could be serving better? And what do we need to do to make sure that that's happening?
Great, thank you. And I'm excited to hear more about Mississippi later in the presentation, but I also want to highlight the example that you just gave because I think it speaks to our next question, which is about the relationship between the preparation reform aspect of this work, how we prepare teachers, and also the policy side of things. So can you speak a little bit more about the relationship between the preparation reform and the preparation policy piece?
Absolutely. When we first started this work, one of the greatest compliments I think we got from some of our educator preparation providers is that this created space and opportunity for them to have ongoing conversation with those who were informing policy at their State Department level, as well as the local education agency practitioners that were then going to be the recipients of their product, which is their graduates. And so having this conversation allowed us to remove some of the barriers or support them in removing some of the barriers to ensuring that what was happening in the educator preparation programs was really in line with what was going to be expected for certification and licensure, and that there was this feedback loop with their district partners to say, in one particular state, I'll never forget this, one of the district personnel we were working with said, if a graduate comes to our building and they are skilled in classroom management, I know they came from this particular institution, or I know if they're skilled in literacy, they came from this institution. How can we make sure that regardless of the institutions that they come from, they have the key skills that we need? And that was really formative for our thinking about the high leverage practices for students with disabilities as well.
Great. Can you speak a little bit more to the high leverage practices and how you see those fitting in with culturally responsive education practices?
Absolutely. We have been working to make more explicit the linkages between high leverage practices and where there's complement with the culturally responsive teaching practices. When we start talking about this type of practice versus this type of practice, a lot of times it creates unnecessary tension. If we think about high leverage practices as foundational knowledge and skill for teaching learners that have certain needs, then students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds fit into that. But there may be additional layering that we need to do in terms of shoring up skills. So how do we take the domain of collaboration and working with parents and professionals, but then really think intentionally about parents from a particular cultural group, racial group, ethnic group, or community might need something very specific. There might be some ways that those high leverage practices were developed that might reflect what some would consider a more quote unquote monocultural perspective. So how do we really stay curious and intentional about making sure that what we consider a good practice is a good practice to inform the communities that we hope to serve? It's always about, for me, staying curious about what do we know and what might we still be able to learn.
Great, very well said. I think we have time for one more question, and it's quite simply, what's next? What do you see on the horizon for how the CDER Center and other OSEP-funded projects that are in the personnel preparation and development space, what do you see as the next big thing that we should be focused on?
One of the things that we are doing through the CDER Center, and I know a couple of other centers are doing this internal work as well. It's really easy to say, go do this, go be more culturally responsive. But it's harder sometimes to say, what might I be doing that's complicit? How might I be complicit in not being culturally responsive or being less responsive than I would hope others would be? And so we have been doing some internal professional development and really thinking about how who we are and what we believe and what we value and what we know shapes the work that we do and the way we provide technical assistance and the way we prepare leaders and teachers. But really making sure that what we're expecting and hoping for our TA recipients to do, that we're also doing that same work, that we are in it with them and thinking about how our identities shape the work that we do, so that ultimately we're getting the teachers and leaders that we want in schools for students with disabilities. So I would say doing that internal work and really staying aware of what's happening in this current moment.
Great. Dr. Mccray, thank you so much for setting us up to have a really productive conversation. And we're going to continue that by drilling down a little bit more on this idea of educational equity and how we embed that in our work. So thank you very much. And I think we're ready for our next slide. I'd now like to introduce our second panelist, Dr. Jen Newton. Dr. Newton is an assistant professor of special education in the Department of Teacher Education at Ohio University. Dr. Newton's research interests include anti-racist, anti-ableist education, early childhood inclusion, and inclusive teacher preparation. She regularly presents locally, regionally, and nationally on a range of inclusive educational topics and serves as the program coordinator for the undergraduate special education teacher preparation program at Ohio University. Prior to her doctoral career, she served as an early interventionist in an inclusive pre-kindergarten teacher. So thank you, Dr. Newton. We're happy to have you here, and please take it away.
Thank you so much. It's so amazing to be here. And as I was listening to Dr. Mccray, I was just sort of like, yes, more of that. So I'm thrilled to be here. It's such an honor to be here and to be listening and learning with all of you. I'm going to build a little on the foundation that Dr. Mccray just built for us and expand a little bit on Lindsay's introduction around the second point, thinking about centering educational equity as we strive to build that diverse workforce. So first, let's start by talking about what educational equity is, what it looks like, how we know if we've achieved it. Educational equity requires an understanding of the unique challenges and barriers that are faced by individuals or by populations. And it requires us to actively dismantle barriers while also providing the additional supports to help overcome the existing barriers. So we have to do a both and here, right? We have to both support the recruitment, preparation, and retention of a diverse workforce while also being responsible for dismantling the barriers that are in place that are preventing us from having lots and lots and lots of people entering into the field that's more reflective of the students that we serve. So it's a both and, as are most things in the work that we do. So while this might not in and of itself ensure equitable outcomes, which we know, we all should strive to ensure that every child has the opportunity to learn from someone who looks like you. I think that's a really important point that Dr. Mccray made. When I was first asked when was the first time that I had a Black teacher, it was when I was in graduate school. And some of you may know her. Dr. Gott was my first ever Black teacher. And so I was 20 probably. So in order for us to cultivate a diverse workforce, we have to recruit, repair, and retain, and engage in systems change. And one of the things that I like to think about around systems change is this model of equity-empowered systems. Go ahead and advance. I should have done that like 4 minutes ago. So here's our language about educational equity. I'm going to have you go one more, and we're going to talk a little bit about structural racism. This can be challenging for us to acknowledge that there is a system in place in which our public policies or institutional practices, for those of us in teacher education, sometimes that can be SAT and ACT score requirements. It can be GPA in some ways. If you're working in teacher prep like I am, you might be dealing with some of these things, particularly coming out of the pandemic. Maybe our students' grades are lower than they had been previously. Maybe ACT and SAT and Praxis scores aren't as high as they were. As students have been going through a lot of things. We need to think about our institutional practices and whether or not they're creating space for a diverse workforce and for students to come in and have the opportunity to learn from us and to improve and to continue to take advantage of those opportunities. So within structural racism, we have to consider all the various things that are at work. And the ways in which some of our policies and procedures are potentially reinforcing and perpetuating inequities. We have to also consider the dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. So structural racism is not something that I can decide to change on my own. It's not something my university or your university has said, this is how we're going to operate. It's just a feature of our systems. And we all have to sort of work to see those features and be able to call them out, be able to think about solutions or ways of dismantling those barriers, because both in recruitment of a diverse workforce, we also have to be recruiting them into something that is responsive and nimble enough to be a healthy and inviting workplace. So if we continue to think through this within this system of structural racism, we will also, if we don't address structural racism, if we don't address educational equity, we will continue to see those numbers that Dr. Mccray shared, because there are systemic barriers to entering the field of education, and there are systemic barriers in retaining a diverse workforce. So again, it's a both and, right? Let's go to the next slide. So that one way we can think about this is through an equity empowered framework. This framework actually consists of 3 different models. An allied designed model and a savior designed are also included. But for today, I just want to talk about the components of an equity empowered system. And so when you see on the left, it gives us some examples of like the ways in which this system operates. What are the services? The services are built and centered on experiences of disparity groups. So we have to engage in power sharing. We need to ask our students, what are the barriers that they're facing, and then try to do something about it. Like at my university, we were consistently hearing from students that the ACT, SAT Praxis score was a barrier. And so we worked through it and we removed it ultimately as a requirement. The students have been doing amazing, but that we know those standardized tests are not just. So we removed it. The social position, acknowledging that social position and stratification emphasize addressing causes of inequitable outcomes rather than just trying to solve the immediate problem, but looking at the larger structural issue that allowed that problem to happen to begin with. And then, like I said, this issue of sharing power, ensuring diverse representation and redistributing resources so that there is equitable decision-making, allow students to have voice, and ensure that there is a way for us to get that feedback on why students may not be entering into our programs, why they may not be persisting in the field, so that we have some good information and data about systems change that are needed. And then, like I said about structural racism, just deconstructing institutional racism and systemic oppression, and reconstructing systems that are rooted in and advance equity of the historically marginalized group. So we're going to talk a little bit at the very end here about racial justice and what it means to be rooted in and advance equity. And then finally, the residual impact. Providing that trauma and bias reducing care so that we do as little as harm as possible to our candidates as well as to teachers in the field, amplify the lived experiences of our teachers so that we're getting good information. Like Dr. Mccray said, we tend to get further and further removed from the work of teaching and learning in schools. And so it's important that we amplify the lived experience of disabled students, of our teachers, of all students, and teachers within the special education system. All of those lived experiences have to be part of our data. Unapologetically name these root causes, prioritize wellness, and then promoting economic equity, which is clearly a factor around structural racism and this idea of racial justice. So I'll just wrap up with the framing of racial justice as extension beyond anti-racist. It really is about deconstructing the deliberate systems that are in place that perpetuate inequity and establishing some intentional and preventative measures for that. So one of the sort of last ways to think about this is to remember the both and. So both recruiting, preparing, and retaining, and ensuring that we're working to dismantle systems that prevent students and teachers from accessing our programming, for persisting in the field, for those retention and nutrition issues. So thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Dr. Newton. I really appreciate that you were able to bring a little bit more depth around the conversation of educational equity and structural racism. So I have a few questions for you. The first several are going to drill down on that idea of the both and approach. So you mentioned that we need to have a both and solution. We need to be providing supports around diversifying the workforce while eliminating barriers that prevent diverse candidates from entering that workforce. Can you highlight maybe just one or two examples of what you see as those greatest barriers to entry to the workforce, and what solutions we might want to consider for those?
So in my experiences as a teacher educator and in a primarily white institution, predominantly white institution, I think that the barriers are that the field is predominantly white. So I see that as one of the biggest barriers for a diverse workforce, is that a lot of students who aren't white that want to be teachers come and talk to me and don't feel affinity within the field. And so I think that's an important part of the both and, right, is that we have to create both an opportunity for there to be affinity groups within, even at predominantly white institutions, and create opportunities for that recruitment to be a safe place. And then the other, I think, are some of those systemic barriers like testing that I talked about, or not all of our candidates are coming out of programs, high school programs that prepared them well for standardized testing. Standardized tests are inherently biased anyway. So if those are a barrier, we have to think about what we're getting from them, what's the information that we're gaining, and then what is it potentially costing us? And what ways can we be flexible and get that information in different ways? A lot of programs have moved, a lot of states have moved to diverse ways of measuring preparedness. And the tests are usually just a piece of it, but for entry into teacher education, they tend to be a barrier.
Great, thank you so much. To continue further on this idea of both and, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of the fact that we need to both diversify our special education workforce and ensure that all of our special education workforce is equipped with the skills to be culturally relevant educators. Can you talk a little bit about that both and solution, where it's that dual focus on diversifying the workforce and culturally relevant competence for all?
Well, that's such a good point, Lindsay. And I think it also brings back to, like Dr. Mccray said, I also got my PhD at the University of Kansas on an OSEP leadership grant. I was not really looking at that as a possibility. And when I look around now and I think back to my experience there, almost all the other doc students were also white. And there was no sort of preparation for me in anti-racist teaching. Now, it was 11 years ago, so I'm not mad about it, but I'm still saying that we have to diversify that in that level too. So as teacher preparers, those of us who are teacher educators, who are working with teacher candidates every day, we have to also be culturally competent and able to teach our students about anti-racist and educational equity issues. And that's not where all of our teacher educators are. So an investment, I think, in teacher educators' work toward becoming anti-racist, so that we can ensure that our students are leaving our programs as to the point that Dr. Mccray said about that universal expectation that all teachers will leave with an anti-racist framework for education, is incredibly important for our diverse workforce, right? We have to be a safe place for a diverse number of candidates who want to come in and learn from us. And that, there's lots of components to that, but we haven't really seen a push within higher education and teacher preparation to move faculty in that way. So I think there is a lot of work to be done there, and that has to be a component of a diverse workforce. If you come into a teacher prep program and you find yourself in a consistent place of microaggression, is that going to be a place you want to persist, right? Is that going to be a field you want to persist in? So that's work we absolutely all have to do.
I so appreciate you bringing in the perspective of the doctoral level. I am positive that there are people listening to this panel right now who have OSEP doctoral preparation grants. And so I appreciate you thinking about how we bring those folks, the future leaders in the field and our future faculty members, and how we bring them into this conversation. So thank you for making that very important point. So as someone in the preparation space, when you are working with teacher candidates, what do you see resonating with those candidates about equity empowered frameworks, and what do you see them struggling with?
Oh, that's such a good question. I see them very much right now, and I think this has been increasingly happening, that our students are becoming much more focused on really identifying the ways in which racism shows up and being able to name it and to talk about it more openly and to sort of call out those microaggressions or those injustices and have conversations about them. I'm definitely noticing more robust discussions around how do we ensure that schools are equitable, particularly when we're thinking about discipline or referral to special education. How do we ensure that our evaluations are meaningful and that our IEPs are written in a way that allows students to get what they need and aren't rooted in bias against a certain student, specifically a disability category, that kind of thing. We're definitely seeing students, in my experience, it's much more, it's easier to talk with them about those things now. I think the part we're still struggling with is those rooted biases about how certain kids are not supposed to be in the classroom, or that there are certain students who we have to punish in ways that prevent them from accessing their education. And so those are things that we have to continue to work toward, is helping our candidates see that the strategies you saw in your school weren't always the best strategies or the most equitable strategies, right? Getting at root cause, constantly going back to what's going on here. How do we address the structural, if the school system structure isn't working for a student, what can we do to help make that more nimble in a way that allows the child to access it? So really like broadening that construct of how we think about the role of students in their own learning. I think that's a thing that we continue to really struggle with.
Great. So I'm going to ask you one final question. I appreciate that in your remarks, you brought in a systems change perspective, and that you addressed that a very important component of this work. And I think we can all agree systems change work is hard. Cannot underscore that enough. It is difficult, challenging work. Can you speak to some of those challenges, and along with that, some of the opportunities we have to have these conversations at a systems level?
I think it's so important that systems change is part of all of the work that we do. It's not sort of like, today I'm going to work on dismantling systems, but that it's in little bits and pieces. It's just a little chisel at taking out a little bit of the grout as we move. I don't have expectations, and none of us should, that I'm going to change the world, I'm going to change the system. But I do think that there are things we can do related, and I really push students and teacher candidates in this way. We have to be politically active. Teaching is a civic profession, and we must engage at that level so that we can be doing that advocating. And how do we ensure that students understand that their role is to have a voice? Right, that it's not the field of education is one where we're promoting our teachers to be educational experts and to see themselves in that way and to have that confidence in their own ability to advocate for what's best for their students. I think that's one of the things that's really important in thinking about systems change. Another, I think, is calling out inequities when we see it. There's so often, and I think this is a way we have to train our brains, because so often we're just like, that's the way it is. And we haven't conceptualized the ways in which that thing that exists does harm and how it might happen another way that could be less harmful. And so part of it is engaging in that conversation around, does it have to be like this? What are we getting out of this? What's it costing us? Who's benefiting from this system barrier that's in place? And I think that's a good framework to just have rolling in your mind all the time. Who's not at the table? Who are we talking about? I think one of the things in special education we do a lot is we talk about disability and we talk about people with disabilities, but we're not including the disabled population in our conversations and centering those voices. And that's a really critical part of systems change, is who are we serving and what are they saying about what's happening within our system? So I think those are kind of some things I like to keep in mind around systems change. It's just ongoing, lifetime kind of slug, you know?
It sure is. It sure is. And I think if we had the answers, it would be a very different landscape that we would be in right now. So Dr. Newton, thank you so much for taking the time to share your remarks. I'm going to move us on to our next slide and our next panelist. Our next panelist is Dr. William Drakeford, who is an associate professor at Bowie State University. Dr. Drakeford earned his PhD in special education and corrections education from the University of Maryland, College Park, where he also served as an assistant professor. In his 11 years at Bowie State University, he has been the PI on 3 OSEP grants, and in 2018 began a 4-year collaboration with the University of Maryland to prepare 48 pre-doctoral students from traditionally underrepresented groups for doctoral study on topics related to language and literacy for high-need students. Dr. Drakeford has been active in creating and organizing materials relevant to the early childhood special education program and supporting students in those programs. On a national level, Dr. Drakeford has presented information at the Division of Early Childhood 2021 to discuss techniques for recruiting and retaining diverse student groups. So welcome, Dr. Drakeford, and please take it away. I am wondering if we are having technical difficulties getting Dr. Drakeford on.
Yeah, sorry. It looks like he dropped off the call. Would you mind if we move to Courtney, if that works?
We can absolutely do that, and then hopefully he will get his tech issues sorted out, and we can circle back to him. So we're going to move ahead to Dr. Courtney Vancleave. I'll introduce her. She is here to give our state education agency perspective. Dr. Vancleave serves as the Bureau Director for Educator Effectiveness at the Mississippi Department of Education. She is an advocate for rural education, given her experience as a student, teacher, principal, and regional director in Mississippi's public school system. Her strong foundation in public education system led Dr. Vancleave to the University of Mississippi's Principal Corps program, and then the Harvard Graduate School of Education's Doctor of Education Leadership program. Before that, she committed 7 years to the Clarksdale Municipal School District, first as a middle school English teacher, and then as a principal. So welcome, Dr. Vancleave. We're very excited to have you here, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, and so appreciate that warm introduction, as well as just the opportunity to speak with and learn from all of you today, as has been noted previously. Every opportunity I have to engage in this sort of setting, I think I end up taking more notes even than most on people to follow up with and learnings to move forward. So it certainly is a pleasure. As Lindsay noted, I think the work that I do here at the Mississippi Department of Education as the Bureau Director of Educator Effectiveness is really rooted in my experience with Mississippi's public school system. Specifically, I had the opportunity to serve as a principal, where I worked alongside a group of incredibly diverse and effective teachers, many of whom encountered several of the systemic barriers to a career in education that we are striving to address at the Mississippi Department of Education today. If you'll go to the next slide. I'll start, though, by just giving a bit of context for Mississippi and where we are in terms of some of our critical shortages statewide. So as outlined by the Mississippi Critical Shortage Act, the MDE, the Mississippi Department of Education, identifies both geographic and subject shortage areas through an annual formula. These districts are then published on our website so that educators and aspiring teachers may gain access to support such as loan forgiveness, relocation, and housing assistance. What you're seeing on the screen right now is a map that outlines some of our counties and geographic areas that have in prior years been identified as critical shortage geographic areas. The one that I'll highlight for you that is personally important to me, given my time serving in the Clarksville Municipal School District, this is the area over towards the western side of the state where you're seeing a number of blue counties, and that's an area known as the Mississippi Delta. And so within the Mississippi Delta, our school communities predominantly serve students who identify as Black or African American, and they also support high percentages of students who receive free and reduced price lunch as well. This has historically been a critical shortage region for us in the state, and what we're seeing though is that a number of our shortage areas are actually increasing even as well, while deepening in areas such as the Mississippi Delta. So that's sort of the regional side of our shortages that we're seeing in Mississippi, but then also there's this subject area shortage focus that we have. And so we have historically seen subject area shortages in areas like science and math, some of our STEM fields. The area within our recent shortage survey data, that the areas that are now cropping up are also increased shortages of elementary and special education teachers as well. So to address this context, the Mississippi Department of Education has been working to establish what we like to call a human capital highway with regionally relevant on-ramps into the profession to support an increasingly diverse and effective educator workforce. With that continued focus on recruiting, retaining, and sustaining those diverse and effective educators that we know our children across the state need and deserve. So if you'll move to the next slide, I will offer some strategies that we have been engaging with. So as I mentioned, what we're looking for is, first off, regionally relevant on-ramps into the profession. So to address that particular strategy, what we have employed is a regional recruitment model. So here at the Mississippi Department of Education, we have a team of recruiters, and our team of recruiters, each individual recruiter focuses on one of our congressional districts. We have 4 congressional districts here in the state, and so within those areas, they are working to establish partnerships between community colleges, educator preparation programs, districts, and us here at the state agency as well, along with aspiring educators, so that if somebody is interested in education as early as high school, they have a ready contact within our recruitment team. And so that regional recruitment model has generated a number of findings. And so we've taken kind of a different approach. So within Congressional District 2, I'll talk a little bit about our performance-based licensure pilot. That is targeting some of the systemic barriers that our educators and aspiring educators in the Delta have faced. Within Congressional District 3, what we found is our educator preparation providers are very strong drivers in teacher assistant focused pathways. And here in Mississippi, what we found is that our teacher assistant pool is often mirroring our diverse student body, even more so than our current lead licensed teacher pool. So we certainly see our teacher assistants as a core recruitment strategy, and we've been happy to see that some of our educator preparation providers have been taking that mantle up to offer some tailored opportunities for teachers assistants in the state. And then on the coast, it's another unique area where we have a lot of military personnel and military families. So we're also striving to increase the percentages of male educators here in Mississippi as well. And so some of our regional strategy on the coast in Congressional District 4 has focused on military veterans and their families as they are transitioning throughout the state of Mississippi. If they have an interest in education, we look to support that as well. So we've talked a lot about systemic barriers. Dr. Mccray and Dr. Nelson have both mentioned some of those, and I think that that's the both and strategy that was mentioned before. Like, we both have to support diverse educators and remove some of the systemic barriers that they're facing is certainly at play in our statewide strategy here in Mississippi. And so one of those areas that we focus on is residency preparation. So we have launched the Mississippi Teacher Residency. The barrier that it's specifically striving to address is twofold. One is just the cost of entering into educator preparation. So our Mississippi Teacher Residency is a fully funded undergraduate or graduate preparation route. So we partnered with 3 universities there. The other barrier is just is the lack of early career supports that we have found are leading to some of our early career teacher attrition. And so we offer a mentor stipend. We offer both a 2-year mentor, high quality mentor who's selected by the district, and then offer that mentor a stipend in appreciation for their ongoing commitment and the time that they're sharing with their residents as well. Currently within the Mississippi Teacher Residency, 66% of our residents identify as a person of color, which far outpaces the national average at about 20%. And within that, because we are striving to address some of those content area shortages, we are offering that program is specifically targeted to address endorsements and preparation in both elementary education and special education. Another innovation that we have worked on is our performance-based licensure approach. As Dr. Nelson mentioned, we found that the research is fairly compelling and consistent on 3 fronts. 1, students benefit from access to teachers of color. 2, the licensure testing criterion often disproportionately screens teachers of color. And 3, the current licensure testing criterion, our licensure tests aren't always predictive of educator effectiveness. And so because we do ultimately want all of our educators to be effectively prepared and performing within our classrooms, what we're currently piloting as a state is a performance-based alternative to our current licensure testing requirements to recognize those individuals who have struggled with the licensure test requirements and yet are demonstrating their effectiveness as rockstar teacher assistants, emergency licensed teachers, special sort of out of content area teachers. And we've had some interesting findings from that particular pilot. One is that 100% of our pilot participants identify as Black or African American. And we also found that they had a number of years of classroom experience. The pilot averages 14 years of experience across both cohorts. And those individuals have that experience, as I mentioned, either as a Head Start teacher, as a teacher assistant, out of content area teacher, and they really are dedicated to their classrooms and to their communities and have evidence of past performance that indicates that they should be able to continue to do so. So we're looking for pathways to support them through performance-based alternative. And then the final component that we've really pursued is this idea of aligned support. Alignment has come up before, and a lot of that has actually come out of our work, as Dr. Mccray mentioned, with the CDER Center through the Teaching and Leading Solution Groups. And one of those areas that we're really excited about is that from requests from special educators and from special education directors, we received a request to provide more clear guidance for special education teachers on our professional growth system. The struggle there is we did not want to replicate silos between general and special education teachers. So what we're launching is a rubric specific to our special education teachers that recognizes some of the specialization that they have advocated for previously, while also maintaining a very clear alignment to our existing teacher growth rubric and those high leverage practices that have been mentioned earlier. So that was through a lot of collaboration collaboration between our office as the Office of Teaching and Leading and our Office of Special Education as facilitated through our work with the CDER Center. So I think an ongoing theme of this is just the importance of partnerships and alignment so that we truly are sustaining that diverse and effective teacher workforce. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Lindsay.
All right, thank you, Dr. Vancleave. I'm excited to get to talk a little bit about the state perspective. We've heard from several preparation providers and people who are in that preparation space, but I think you are uniquely poised to offer a different perspective, sort of what happens more toward the in-service side of things. So first things first, I very much appreciate that you mentioned some concrete strategies that are happening in Mississippi right now related to the performance-based licensure, the residency, things of that nature. Maybe let's talk about perhaps the performance-based licensure first. What have been some lessons learned around that? What has been successful? What maybe not so successful? What are your lessons learned?
Yes, many lessons learned. So Mississippi is the first state. This is an unprecedented pilot. We are the first state to actually really just zero in on the impact of the licensure testing criterion and try to dig deep into some potential alternatives there. So I think the first lesson, one thing that we did exceptionally well out of the gate is to hold true to the notion that those who are closest to the problem must guide the solution. And so what we did before even initiating the performance-based licensure model that we currently have is we conducted focus groups. And we conducted focus groups to prototype a model in communities across the Mississippi Delta who are most impacted by disproportionate critical teacher and diversity shortages. And we took the model out to our districts. We had our focus groups included teachers, parents, superintendents, principals, potential PBL candidates, and we took the model out to them with a lot of humility and said, some of this might be good and some of this might be terrible. What do we need to keep in this prototype model? And what do we need to change? And we took their feedback seriously. And then we would take their feedback from the prototype model, and then we would take it out to another focus group for another round of feedback. And because of that, I think we, from day one, had a strong model to go off of. I think a lesson that we have learned that's a harder lesson to learn is I think that there is still kind of a theme of equating passing the test with educator effectiveness. And so we've had to do a lot of intentional messaging around that the research just isn't currently backing that up, that many of the licensure testing are not consistently predicting educator effectiveness, that it's not that we're saying, we're gonna do a wholesale revocation of that requirement, but that we do believe that there should be alternatives to particularly target pools of our educator workforce that those particular policies aren't serving.
Great. So I'll pose that same question, but for some of the other strategies that you mentioned. So feel free to pick where you focus, whether that's the regional recruitment model or residencies or whatever. What have been some lessons learned from those?
On the residency model, we've learned two things, kind of the secret sauce of the residency program, if you will. What we have learned first and foremost is the impact that intentional district and university partnerships has on teacher recruitment and early career preparation. And I think that because of the conversations that the residency program has given the space to happen, we've seen some notable changes within even the universities that we've partnered with only within the last 2 years. So one of our universities, completely of their own volition, switched to an entire residency-based model for their entire ed prep program, just coming off of 2 years worth of data for the residency model. Another educator preparation program, what we're seeing with them is they're bringing in a lot of district and school administrators as adjunct faculty to provide additional coursework and supports for aspiring education leaders and aspiring teachers. And so that intersection of theory and practice has really tightened in a lot of our universities as a result of participating in the residency. But then it's funny because it's also impacted our districts, who are coming to us with realizations of saying, our universities don't know who to recruit or how to recruit because we're not telling them our needs. Like we're the district who's in their back door, and our university isn't clear on the fact that like we need tremendous special education teachers desperately, like yesterday, and they haven't had that line of communication before. So I think we're seeing that bimodal communication between districts and universities is a big insight that we've had on the residency side. And I think so, and then I'll do one last insight that we've had on, because this is a very early insight with unaligned support, because we were so intentional in aligning our growth rubric for special education teachers with the existing teacher growth rubric and the high leverage practices. One, we've gotten a tremendous degree of buy-in from districts and universities alike. And I think the proof is in the pudding for me when we get comments from principals who've piloted the rubric, who are in a co-observation space. And they said that I was able to observe a teacher providing inclusion services at the same time as our general education teacher was leading instruction. I was able to observe them at the same time and note shared trends in their support for all students in that classroom, and to actually have a co-coaching conversation based on that tool that I wouldn't have been able to have before because I don't have the degree of experience in special education. But with this tool, I felt so much more confident in actually having that observation and having that conversation. So I think that is a neat early development for us as well.
Great, thank you. So the next question I want to ask is around data. Obviously, some of your efforts are still in the pilot phase, so keeping that in mind, what sort of data are you collecting, or do you have plans to collect to inform all of these efforts?
Yep. So when you're talking about collecting data, and this is a learning that I had to learn along the way as well. There's process data and then there's program data. And I think that we frequently engage in program review or evaluation, which is often like a lag measure. Mm-hmm. And we don't often engage in process measurement and review, which are some of your leading indicators of early performance. So within both of our programs and some of our process work, what we do is and some of the data that we're collecting is even in the moment from a lot of our district coordinators around some of the communications that have gone out where we're like, hey, this is our recruitment flyer for the year. What recommendations do you have? Is this actually going to be targeting the pools of educators that you are seeking to receive in your district? So we process evaluate on a lot of our communications and a lot of our requirements. Sometimes the testing data that we'll ask from in terms of student achievement results on the performance-based licensure pilot. Similarly, we touch base with the districts and saying, hey, we're seeing that this data for STAR report, for example, you guys are reporting this scale score. What we were looking for was the average months of growth. Why are you reporting this scale score? Instead, what value are you finding in this result that we aren't immediately seeing? But then, so on the more program evaluation side, then sort of your large scale measures, we're looking at pieces around years of experience on the PBL side. We're looking at clinical hours and mentoring hours on the residency side. we'll be looking this year at professional growth system summative scores, particularly for our first year Mississippi teacher residency candidates. We've got comparison classrooms set up for our performance-based licensure folks to look at the degree of effectiveness that we're seeing there. We're also pulling data around geographic proximity, noting that research often finds that teachers live within 13 miles often of where they graduated high school. So we're even pulling data on that front of how long have you lived in your community? How long have you worked in this community? Do you intend to stay in teaching long term? So we're looking at data across the actual amount of preparation that's happening within the Mississippi teacher residency side. We're looking at the level of experience and effectiveness on both performance-based and residency side. And then we're also looking at those sort of as an effectiveness measure. Then we're also looking at characteristics around retention for both programs, how they might be similar and how they actually might be very different depending on the geographic area and the pools of candidates that we're attracting as a result.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Vancleave. It was nice to hear sort of from that in-service perspective, some really great things, innovative things that Mississippi is doing. So thank you for providing those examples.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Great. So unfortunately, I believe that Dr. Drakeford is still having technical difficulties. In lieu of getting to hear him present, I do want to highlight to everyone that there is a handout associated with this session, and that a lot of the specific recruitment and retention strategies that he would speak to are included in that handout. So encourage you to take a look at those. There are 3 OSEP funded centers at Bowie State University right now, one around Early Childhood Engagement Center, Special Education and Early Development Center, and a Culturally Responsive Educational Leaders and Special Education Center. So if any of that is of interest to you, I highly encourage you to take a look at the handout. With that, I think I'm going to move us into final Q&A. So I'd like to bring back all of our panelists together. And we're just going to end with a few different questions about what we've talked about today and really sort of talk about what the future will bring for us. So this question is for all of you, and I'd be very interested in hearing all of your perspectives on this. I have a question from our audience. How do we ensure efforts to diversify the workforce are inclusive of educators with diverse disability status and LGBTQ+ teachers?
I guess I'll jump in on that. I think that it's about broadening our construct of diversity, right? And ensuring that our spaces are supportive and welcoming for all the ways in which students identify. And if in traditional prep programs, that can be a time. One of the things that I recommend all programs do is look at your paperwork and look at your application, look at the way that your portfolios are collected, the program data, and allow for different identities to be acknowledged in those spaces so that students can change their name or their pronouns and that they can consistently be recognized within their own identities. We all need to do a lot of work in changing our forms from that male-female binary to being more inclusive to the students and teachers that are actually in the field. And that's maybe feels like a little thing, but it can be incredibly challenging sometimes for teacher educators to make those shifts. So having those conversations is really important. Most of us work on universities that have LGBTQ centers that can do safe zone training and provide a resource so that everyone gets that kind of basis understanding of pronouns and language and how to use inclusive language, which should be an ongoing conversation that we're all engaged in, so that we're continuously growing and doing that work to ensure that our students are safe. And then the other part of it is making sure our schools are safe, which is that other both and piece of it. And we have to ensure that the field will protect teachers and that they will be safe in the classrooms, which doesn't always happen. And that can be a reason that we see teachers leaving the field. So we have to work on the systems change in the schools and districts and communities as well, so that teachers can show up in their full identities and be valued in that space.
Great, thank you. Would anybody else? Oh, thank you. Go ahead.
I'll quickly build on that, which is that I think that, you know, in any broad deep effort, it especially when we're talking about workforce, it's also the recognition that systems are people. You know, systems are a combination of people, and so one thing that I personally try to hold for myself is that, you know, when we're talking about systemic inequities or a lack of inclusion, it's often a combination of, you know, within yourself, you operating in coordination with other people, and then yes, there are some systems levers that, in terms of policy and whatnot, that can get pulled or can reinforce as well. And so I think the personal charge that I hold is often for myself as well, is that to conduct my own personal inventory consistently of some of the bias and the blind spots that I may have across different lines of identity, while also holding true for myself that in education, particularly to be an educator in Mississippi, I also always have to center race and ethnicity in all of my work to be an educator here in Mississippi, while not also ever letting myself off of the hook of a consistent and continual personal inventory of where are some of my blind spots across lines of ability, across lines of gender or sexual orientation, religion, anything. Like I have to continue to do that work within myself as well.
Great, thank you.
And I'll add, as a Black woman and a scholar who ascribes to Black feminist theories and Black feminisms, I'm always thinking about the ways that people might be multiply marginalized or minoritized. And so I try not to think about, well, if we focus on race, then we must not be focusing on disability. And if we focus on disability, we must not be focusing on gender identity. I think I also approach the work historically. I think sometimes we get into this ahistorical, what's the issue of the day? But if we look at the historical fight for civil rights, racism was the most and continues to be the most entrenched. But when you go back to Brown versus Board of Education and those rights, that sort of opened the door for other civil rights activism. So I would caution us from saying, well, what about this group or what about that group? We are all being minoritized and marginalized in ways that don't serve any of us. And just by focusing on ethnic and racial diversity, it doesn't detract from focusing on disability. We all need representation. We all deserve to be taught and prepared by people who look and have similar experiences as us, whether it's neurodiversity, racial diversity, linguistic diversity. So I would caution us from getting into the position of juxtaposing one minoritization over another. And that's just the way I try to think about it, because we all then potentially become complicit in the oppression of someone else. So how can we continue to make sure that the tides rise all of the boats?
Thank you so much for that comment. I see the snaps. Thank you. Yeah, I do not see any other audience questions, so I will leave us off with one question that I have come up with, and it has to do really with the fact that I think the field has had a tough school year. It's been a long slog to try to deal with some of the issues this year. We're looking at return to school efforts starting up sooner than I think any of us is ready to realize. And I just want to end on a hopeful note. What in the personnel preparation or development space makes you hopeful as we move forward? Where do you think our opportunities are? What excites you? What makes you hopeful?
I'll start again, so that since we've decided we have an order. I am incredibly hopeful about my students and the pre-service candidates that I see entering into the field, persisting through a pandemic. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that some of the teachers who will be coming out of programs haven't been in classrooms for 3 semesters, and that they're persisting in the field and that they're trying to make it work in ways that they have been I think, really deeply affected in ways because they haven't had access to teachers or classrooms or kids in a lot of situations. And so the students give me a lot of hope. The numbers of students pursuing initial license at the graduate and undergrad level in my special education program have tripled in the last 3 years. We're continuing to see just brilliant, committed candidates coming to us. And I can't wait to see them. And I think having some enthusiasm around their resilience in this time has really helped us to build some community around that. So I'm very excited about the potential of our field going forward, and of the strong advocates that I see teachers who are really thinking a lot about ableism and really thinking a lot about racism and thinking a lot about homophobia in classrooms and schools. And I think that we're embarking upon a new generation of teachers that are teacher advocates. So I'm excited about that.
Great. Thank you so much.
I will continue the order that we have spontaneously established. So at the systemic level, what I'm hopeful for, I think, is a result of COVID-19, within the state of Mississippi, in respect to the tremendous upheaval that districts and schools were experiencing, we suspended a number of our policies at a state level. And I think what I'm hopeful for is that it's prompting a questioning of what we've always accepted as given. It's prompting questions of the status quo. I think one particular example that comes to mind is, in fact, the licensure testing criterion. And because we're seeing, because that policy was suspended, there's a new conversation around, maybe it's not that we've got an educator shortage. Maybe it's that we have a shortage of individuals who are able to meet our current requirements, yet are extremely excited and inspired to become educators in our state. So the conversation is shifting towards, like, what are some of the policies? What are some of the requirements that are not serving us, but more importantly, are not serving children right now? And so I think it's forcing that questioning, I think, at the systems level. And then, at the interpersonal level, I'm a huge recruiter for the state of Mississippi. And what I can tell you, I was just on a work group call, we have some of the most dedicated teachers, administrators, principals, superintendents, colleges who just want to work together. They want to work together to make our education system better. And despite such a wild year, their faith and their hope that we can do better, and even their push on us as the state agency to be like, no, we want more rigorous tools. Give us more guidance on this front. We need more, because we're going to be continuously better. It's very inspiring.
Great, thank you.
And I'll echo my colleagues' sentiments, but also thinking about the opportunity that has come out of such challenge. We have learned, I think, more about ourselves as individuals and as a people that I hope will continue. I talked to some of my colleagues about these conversations can't stop. Just because we are slowly moving out of timeout, because that's what COVID felt like, is we were all in timeout, as we're moving back into the world, that I hope we will view each other and treat each other with more grace, more kindness, more thoughtfulness, and recognize that our lives are interconnected. And if we do more for those that have been underserved, those that have been disadvantaged, we all benefit. And I think related to that, the recent ed priorities that have come out, they just made me so excited, thinking intentionally about student access to equitable resources and making sure that the workforce is reflective of what we're talking about. So I think just capitalizing on all of the challenge, all of the tragedy that some of us have faced individually and collectively, that we will grow out of this stronger, more critical, and move forward in ways that continue to make us better.
Great. Thank you so much. And on behalf of the audience, I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Mccray, Dr. Newton, and Dr. Vancleave. It's been a very enlightening, informative panel, and thank you all for taking the time to share with us. And with that, I think this is the end of our panel. Have a great day.